March 7, 1945, late afternoon. The air above the Rhine River trembles with distant thunder. Columns of exhausted American infantry move cautiously down the sloping banks toward the German town of Remagen. Smoke drifts over the water, curling from shattered rooftops. For months, every crossing of the Rhine had been blasted apart, every bridge reduced to twisted steel. But here, through the mist and shell fire, something impossible stands. A bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge, a black iron skeleton stretching across the Rhine, scarred but intact. Lieutenant Carl Timmerman of the U.S. 9th Armored Division stares in disbelief. Behind him, tanks grind forward, their engines growling on the wet cobblestones. Ahead, German machine guns bark from the far bank, but the bridge still holds. On the opposite side, German defenders peer through binoculars, stunned. They'd been told all crossings were gone, that the Rhine would protect the heart of Germany. Now, that illusion is collapsing, because within hours, the U.S. Army would do the unthinkable. They would seize this bridge and build another overnight. The last great barrier of the Western Front was about to fall. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final brutal phase. The Reich was collapsing, but it refused to die quietly. After the failure of Hitler's last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, the Western Front had begun to unravel. Allied forces had clawed their way through the Ardennes, through snow, mud, and fire, pushing the Germans back toward their homeland. In the east, the Red Army was already deep inside Poland, preparing for its own assault on Berlin. From the west, the British, Canadians, and Americans advanced through Belgium and Luxembourg, dismantling the remnants of the once mighty Wehrmacht. Yet between the Allies and the heart of Germany stood one last formidable barrier, the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been both a cultural symbol and a military fortress. Broad, fast-moving, and treacherous, it sliced through western Germany like a natural moat. On its eastern bank rose the Rhineland, a line of hills and industrial towns that had fueled the German war machine. To cross it was to invade Germany itself. Every commander knew that forcing the Rhine would be one of the most difficult and dangerous operations of the war. Hitler knew it too. After the losses in France and the Low Countries, he had ordered a new defensive line built along the river, a last wall of resistance. The idea was simple: destroy every bridge, mine every crossing, and make the Rhine an impenetrable barrier. The German High Command promised him that not a single Allied soldier would set foot on the far bank without paying in rivers of blood. The Allies, however, had momentum and numbers. By March 1945, over 4 million men were positioned along the western approaches to the Rhine, supported by endless columns of armor, artillery, and air power. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower's strategy was clear: crush the remaining German resistance, cross the Rhine in multiple locations, and drive straight into the industrial Ruhr, the heart of Germany's war production. Once the Ruhr fell, Berlin would follow, but there was disagreement among his generals about how to do it. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the northern flank, favored a massive, meticulously planned assault, a crossing supported by overwhelming air cover and coordinated ground forces. In the south, General George S. Patton, impatient and aggressive as ever, wanted to force the river as soon as possible, wherever he could find a weak spot. Between them lay the 1st U.S. Army under General Courtney Hodges, a steady, cautious commander tasked with holding the central front along the Rhine near the small towns of Remagen, Sinzig, and Linz. For months, Allied reconnaissance flights had photographed every bridge spanning the river. By early March, the reports were unanimous: every crossing had been destroyed. German demolition teams had done their work, or so everyone thought. The assumption was that the Rhine would have to be crossed by building new floating pontoon bridges under fire. That meant time, heavy losses, and extraordinary engineering effort. Meanwhile, German troops were in disarray. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, its ranks filled with undertrained conscripts and remnants of shattered divisions. Supply lines had collapsed. Fuel was scarce. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was now a shadow of its former self, unable to contest Allied air superiority. Yet, despite the chaos, the Rhine still held symbolic meaning. Hitler declared that the river was Germany's sacred frontier. To lose it, he said, would mean the war was lost. So when American patrols approached Remagen in early March 1945, They were not expecting a miracle. The men of the 9th Armored Division had been fighting without rest for weeks, capturing villages, clearing pockets of resistance, and enduring constant sniper fire. Their maps showed Remagen as a minor objective, a crossing point to secure before the engineers arrived. What they didn't know was that history had left one bridge standing, damaged, mined but still standing, the Ludendorff Bridge. Built during World War I as a railway link, it spanned 325 meters across the Rhine between Remagen and Erpel. Its massive steel arches and stone towers gave it a fortress-like appearance. German engineers had rigged it for demolition, but in the confusion and retreat, their preparations were incomplete. By sheer chance, as American scouts reached the riverbank, they found the impossible, an open path into the heart of Germany. And with that discovery, everything changed. The calm before the storm was over. The race for the Rhine had begun. As the sun set on the western bank of the Rhine in early March 1945, the Allied command faced a defining choice: how to end the war swiftly without plunging deeper into unnecessary bloodshed. Every general understood that once the Rhine was crossed, Germany's internal defenses would crumble. Yet how that crossing happened, and who achieved it first, carried immense prestige and strategic consequence. Eisenhower's grand strategy was pragmatic. He had no interest in capturing Berlin for glory. His goal was destruction of the German military machine. To do that, he needed bridgeheads, secure footholds across the Rhine, from which to launch the final offensive into the Ruhr. He planned 3 coordinated crossings: Montgomery's massive operation north of the Ruhr, Patton's swift strike farther south, and eventually, a central crossing by Hodge's First Army. But war does not always follow plans drawn on maps. German defenses along the Rhine were patchy, chaotic, and unpredictable. Some sectors were held by veteran divisions fighting with grim resolve. Others by hastily assembled Volkssturm, old men and teenage boys armed with Panzerfausts and rifles from another era. Command communication was fragmentary. Field commanders often received conflicting orders from Berlin. In some cases, they were told to defend to the last man. In others, to withdraw and destroy bridges preemptively. At Remagen, this confusion would prove decisive. The Ludendorff Bridge was not meant to exist by March 1945. Hitler had decreed that every bridge across the Rhine be blown as soon as Allied troops approached within range. The German officer responsible for Remagen, Captain Willy Bratke, faced a grim dilemma. His orders were absolute: destroy the bridge. But he lacked the explosives and manpower to do it effectively. The bridge still carried retreating German troops, vehicles, and wounded. To detonate it prematurely would trap thousands on the western bank, sentencing them to capture or death. So Bratke hesitated. He ordered engineers to wire the structure, but delayed the final blast until the last possible moment. It was a decision born of practicality, and one that would alter the course of the war. On the American side, the advance toward Remagen was spearheaded by Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division. These were not elite paratroopers or specially trained assault forces. They were ordinary soldiers who had been fighting village by village across the Eifel Hills. Their task was to clear remaining pockets of resistance along the Rhine River, not to force a major river crossing. Yet through a combination of initiative and momentum, they reached Remagen far ahead of schedule. The town itself was small, barely more than a cluster of stone houses, a church and a rail station pressed against the steep riverbank. Across the water, the twin towers of the Ludendorff Bridge loomed dark and imposing. Through binoculars, American officers could see German vehicles still crossing. What they could not see were the charges buried deep in the bridge's steel girders and concrete piers, awaiting detonation. Intelligence reports indicated that German units east of the Rhine were regrouping, expecting an Allied pause before the final crossings began. But Eisenhower's headquarters had not yet issued any orders to attempt a crossing near Remagen. The Rhine, everyone believed, was secure. That illusion shattered the moment Lieutenant Timmerman's patrol spotted the intact bridge on March 7th. The news raced through radio channels to division headquarters, then to the 1st Army command post. For a moment, disbelief reigned. Reports were double-checked, maps re-examined. An intact bridge across the Rhine? It seemed impossible. When confirmation finally came, the implications were immediate and electrifying. If the Americans could seize it before the Germans blew it, they would achieve the first crossing of the Rhine by Allied ground forces, an event that would shock Berlin, elate Allied morale, and potentially shorten the war. But there was no time to plan. Every minute risked German engineers completing their demolition. Hodges gave the order, "Take the bridge. Take it now." For the soldiers of the 9th Armored Division, it meant charging headlong into a death trap, a structure laced with explosives, under direct fire, with no guarantee it would hold. For the German defenders, it meant a desperate attempt to destroy what should already have been gone. The stage was set for one of the most unexpected confrontations of the entire Western Front, a battle measured not in days, but in hours. And as the American tanks rolled forward into the smoke and chaos, the struggle for the Ludendorff Bridge and the miracle of Remagen began. The human angle, exhaustion and shock. For the men of the U.S. 9th Armored Division, the road to Remagen had been an unrelenting grind through the wreckage of Western Germany. Weeks of combat had dulled the senses. They had seen forests turned to splinters by artillery, villages reduced to ash, and comrades fall in fields that had no names. When they reached the Rhine, few had energy left for surprise. Yet the sight of the Ludendorff Bridge standing against the smoke-streaked sky froze them in disbelief. It was like finding a door to the enemy's heart left ajar. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, the 23-year-old platoon leader who first spotted the bridge, was the son of a German immigrant. He knew what that river meant. The Rhine was supposed to be inviolable. As his men prepared to move, some laughed nervously, others stared in silence. They knew the bridge could explode at any second, but they also knew they might never get another chance. Behind them, engineers checked their demolition manuals. Medics knelt beside stretchers already laid out in case the structure went up in flames. Soldiers tore off chunks of chocolate, swallowed without chewing, and whispered small prayers. When the order came, "Take the bridge," they moved without hesitation. Every sound seemed amplified. Boots on steel, machine gun bursts ricocheting off the girders, the whistle of artillery shells passing overhead. Men ran, stumbled, and rose again. Some never made it across. But those who did would carry the memory of that crossing for the rest of their lives. For German soldiers on the far bank, the moment was equally surreal. They had been told the bridge was mined, that the Americans would never risk crossing it. Many were barely older than the men charging toward them. When the explosions failed to bring the bridge down, disbelief turned to panic. Orders were shouted, ignored, contradicted. The myth of the Rhine as Germany's last barrier dissolved before their eyes. The tactical angle, a gamble. Against time, from a purely military standpoint, the events at Remagen defied logic. The American advance unit was light, unsupported by artillery or armor in depth. Standard doctrine dictated that no major crossing should be attempted without air cover, coordinated fire support, and established supply lines. Yet the decision to seize the bridge was made in minutes. Colonel Leonard Engemann, commanding the 14th Tank Battalion, faced an impossible equation: wait for reinforcements and risk losing the bridge, or attack immediately and risk being wiped out. He chose the latter. It was an instinctive decision driven by tempo, the understanding that in war, hesitation kills opportunity. The first waves of infantry advanced under covering fire from tanks positioned along the riverbank. Smoke grenades rolled across the bridge, shrouding it in a pale haze. German gunners on the far tower fired blindly into the fog, cutting down anyone who lingered too long in the open. American engineers, crouched under the steel trusses, searched for demolition wires, cutting them where they could. At precisely 3 p.m., a deafening blast tore through the air. The German engineers had triggered the charges. Flames erupted along the deck, smoke billowed, and shards of metal rained down into the river. When the dust cleared, the bridge still stood. The explosion had been too weak. Some of the main charges had been sabotaged. Others were damp or incorrectly placed. For the Americans, it was a miracle, but a fragile one. The structure trembled under the weight of every footstep. Artillery from the eastern bank began pounding the approach, forcing the advancing columns to crawl forward. Communications crackled with chaos. No one knew if the bridge would collapse or hold. Still, the attack pressed on. Tanks rumbled across one by one, their tracks clanging on the steel plates. Each crossing took minutes that felt like hours. Engineers followed with equipment, clearing debris and reinforcing damaged sections. Behind them, the 9th Armored Division's headquarters sent frantic messages up the chain. "We have a bridge over the Rhine." At Allied headquarters, disbelief gave way to exhilaration. Eisenhower immediately grasped what had happened. A bridgehead into Germany, seized intact, ahead of every plan. He ordered the 9th Armored to hold it at all costs. Reinforcements and engineers were rushed forward. Pontoon bridging materials were loaded onto trucks and sent toward Remagen through clogged, cratered roads. For the men on the ground, though, it was still a race against time. Every hour the bridge stood was a victory. Every minute they could move troops and vehicles across brought the war one step closer to Germany's industrial heartland. Yet, the danger was only beginning. The Germans, humiliated and enraged, would not let the loss of the bridge go unanswered. In the hours to come, the Ludendorff Bridge would become the most fiercely targeted structure in all of Europe, the focus of artillery, aircraft, and vengeance. The soldiers who crossed it that day could not know that what they had started would become one of the most daring and symbolic episodes of the war. A moment when nerve and speed outweighed planning and doctrine, and behind the chaos of gunfire and collapsing steel lay another story, one of engineering brilliance and improvisation that turned a single captured bridge into a lifeline across the Rhine. The engineering angle, building the impossible in war. Victories are often attributed to courage or strategy. At Remagen, victory also belonged to engineering, to the quiet precision of men who built under fire. When the Ludendorff Bridge fell into American hands, it was already a corpse held together by bolts and luck. The German demolition had blown gaping holes in its deck. The piers were cracked and the structure swayed ominously with every tank that rumbled across. But the Rhine was wide and swift, and the Americans needed to move entire divisions east before the bridge collapsed. Within hours of the capture, U.S. Army engineers went to work. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, trained for rapid river crossings, arrived with cranes, planking, and repair equipment. They crawled beneath the bridge's smoking girders, cutting away twisted steel, replacing planks and shoring up supports with timbers salvaged from bombed-out rail yards. All the while, German artillery from the East Bank pounded the area relentlessly. Work continued through the night. Arc welders lit the darkness with flashes of blue light. Sparks fell into the river like fireflies. Engineers hauled steel beams by hand, each weighing hundreds of pounds. They worked soaked, sleepless and numb, patching the bridge even as shells exploded around them. Their goal was not elegance, it was survival. Every vehicle that crossed meant one less that had to wait for a pontoon bridge. Every additional support meant another few hours before the inevitable collapse. By dawn, the engineers had done the unthinkable. The Ludendorff Bridge, though battered, was operational. Tanks, trucks, and troops streamed across into the heart of Germany. It was the first time since Napoleon that an enemy army had crossed the Rhine under fire, and it was happening faster than anyone believed possible. But the engineers didn't stop there. Realizing the captured structure could fail at any moment, they began assembling 2 additional floating bridges downstream. Using Bailey Bridge sections and pneumatic pontoons, they worked non-stop, hammering, bolting, and anchoring under constant shelling. One was ready in less than 24 hours, a record even by peacetime standards. The German defenders, watching from the hills beyond Erpel, could scarcely believe it. Through their binoculars, they saw with growing horror the river turning into a highway of invasion. It wasn't just the bridge that had survived. It was American ingenuity that had defied destruction. The German angle, chaos and rage for the German high command. News of Remagen landed like a thunderclap. The Rhine on their final line had been breached. Hitler was reportedly incandescent with rage when the report reached him on March 8th. Witnesses described him pacing violently, his face contorted, demanding to know who was responsible. The failure to destroy the bridge was, to him, a betrayal. He immediately ordered a full investigation and demanded the execution of the officers involved. Captain Willy Bratke, the commander at Remagen, was captured alive, but his superiors were not so fortunate. General Major Richard von Bothmer and several engineers were later executed by firing squad on Hitler's orders. In the field, chaos reigned. The German forces on the eastern bank were in shambles. A patchwork of Wehrmacht remnants, SS detachments, and Volkssturm militias. Commanders tried desperately to organize counterattacks. Artillery units were rushed to the hills above Erpel. Flak batteries were turned earthward to fire at the bridge. The Luftwaffe, though nearly crippled, threw what remained of its strength into the fight. Jet-powered Me-262s, Areto 234 bombers, and even aged Focke-Wulfs were dispatched to strike the crossing. Pilots flew low over the river, releasing bombs that splashed harmlessly into the current or detonated short of the target. Anti-aircraft fire from the western bank filled the sky. Over the next 10 days, the Germans launched more than 400 air sorties, dozens of artillery barrages, and even their last reserve of secret weapons, V-2 rockets, in a futile attempt to destroy the bridge. None succeeded. The structure stood defiantly, scarred and smoking as if mocking every order from Berlin. The loss of Remagen had psychological consequences far beyond its tactical importance. For German soldiers, it was a signal that the war was truly lost. The river that had symbolized Germany's security for generations was no longer a shield. It had been crossed, and the enemy was advancing into the homeland. The moral angle, the war's end in sight among Allied troops. The crossing of the Rhine carried a moral weight that transcended strategy. For years they had fought across Europe, from Normandy's beaches to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, always moving toward an invisible line that marked Germany itself. When they stepped off the Ludendorff Bridge, muddy boots striking the steel plates, they were no longer invaders of occupied lands. They were inside the Reich. There was no triumphalism, only quiet disbelief. Many soldiers felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. They knew the war's end was near, but they also knew what awaited them ahead. Cities in ruins, desperate resistance, and the ghosts of the concentration camps they had begun to uncover. For the Germans on the far side, morale collapsed. Entire units surrendered rather than face encirclement. Civilians fled eastward, carrying what they could on handcarts, terrified of the advancing armies. The propaganda promises of invincibility had shattered. The river that once divided safety from peril now marked the approach of reckoning. And yet, amid the horror and destruction, there was something deeply human about Remagen. It was not just a story of defeat or victory. It was a story of willpower meeting circumstance. On one side, soldiers clung to orders from a dying regime. On the other, men risked their lives to build and repair under fire, driven by a singular purpose: to finish the war. The crossing of the Rhine at Remagen proved that even in the final chaos of World War II, precision, discipline, and endurance could achieve what grand strategy alone could not. It was a triumph not of numbers, but of nerve. The German soldiers who watched in disbelief as the Americans built bridge after bridge realized something terrible and final. Germany's war was over in all but name, and as both sides bled on the riverbanks, the next stage of the struggle, the fierce, chaotic battle for the bridge itself, was about to reach its breaking point. The morning of March 8, 1945, dawned over Remagen in a haze of dust and smoke. The previous day's miracle, the seizure of the Ludendorff Bridge, had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The Americans held the western bank, the bridge itself, and a small foothold across the river. But the Germans were regrouping fast, and the Rhine, for all its symbolism, was still a killing ground. For the soldiers of the 9th Armored Division, there was no time to celebrate. The bridge groaned under constant traffic, tanks, trucks, and endless columns of infantry pouring eastward. Every vibration sent shudders through its steel bones. Engineers, blackened with soot, ran across the deck checking bolts and plates, listening for the ominous creak that might signal collapse. By mid-morning, the first German counterattack began. From the hills beyond Erpel, artillery opened up, heavy 88mm shells plunging into the river and smashing into the bridgehead. American soldiers scrambled for cover among the stone towers. Shrapnel tore through vehicles and men alike. The thunder of the guns rolled across the valley, echoing off the cliffs like a storm. The U.S. engineers refused to stop. Under fire, they continued reinforcing the supports, welding cracks, and patching holes. They worked as if the bridge were alive, a wounded beast that had to be kept breathing no matter the cost. "If that bridge goes," one officer remarked, "half the First Army goes with it." On the far side, German infantry of the LXV Corps launched sporadic assaults, trying to dislodge the American bridgehead. Machine guns rattled from cellars and trenches. The Americans fought house to house in the village of Erpel, clearing basements with grenades and flamethrowers. Tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion rumbled off the bridge to support the infantry, their turrets turning slowly through smoke so thick it turned daylight into dusk. Meanwhile, Allied command raced to exploit the miracle. General Courtney Hodges ordered more divisions to the site. The 78th Infantry Division and the 99th Infantry Division began arriving by the hundreds, pushing eastward across the bridge in endless lines. Traffic control became a nightmare. Jeeps tangled with tanks, ammunition trucks jammed in bottlenecks, and medics struggled to move the wounded back to the western bank. Each hour the bridge stood was another act of defiance. Each vehicle that crossed brought the Allied front deeper into the heart of Germany. By the second day, more than 8,000 men had crossed the Rhine, a feat no one had dared dream possible only 48 hours earlier. But with each success came mounting danger. The Germans were determined to erase the humiliation. At noon, the first wave of Luftwaffe bombers appeared, Me-262 jet fighters and Arado 234 bombers streaking in low over the valley. Sirens wailed. American anti-aircraft gunners opened up with everything they had, filling the sky with black bursts of flak. The jets screamed in, dropped their bombs, and vanished into the haze. The explosions rocked the bridge, but it held. That night, the bombardment intensified. Artillery, mortars, and even self-propelled guns from across the river hurled fire at the crossing. The river glowed red from tracer fire and burning debris. Engineers crawled along the spans in the darkness, guided by flashlights covered in rags to dim the glow. They replaced burned planks, reinforced joints, and dragged the dead off the deck. One young engineer later recalled, "You didn't think about living or dying. You just thought, if we can keep it standing till morning." By March 9th, the American bridgehead stretched nearly 5 miles deep. Tanks and infantry were pressing inland toward Bruckhausen and Rheinbreitbach, expanding the foothold that would soon become a full-scale invasion corridor. But every expansion brought heavier German counterfire. Hitler, furious beyond measure, had ordered the bridge destroyed at any cost. He promised medals to those who succeeded and execution for those who failed. That cost now came in the form of desperation. On the evening of March 9th, the Germans unleashed a wave of V-2 rockets, the same weapons that had terrorized London, aimed at the bridge and the town of Remagen. Launched from Holland and the Ruhr, they streaked high into the stratosphere before plunging down at supersonic speed. Their detonations tore massive craters into the surrounding hills, flattening houses and shattering windows for miles. But the missile's accuracy was poor. Not one struck the bridge. Still, the attacks took their toll. The Ludendorff steel arches sagged visibly. The main support beams were warped, and sections of the deck had to be replaced every few hours. The bridge was dying, and everyone knew it. Yet more troops continued to cross, driven by urgency, by orders, by momentum that could not be stopped. By the end of the 5th day, over 25,000 men and 2,500 vehicles had moved into Germany. The bridge that wasn't supposed to exist had become the spearhead of an entire army. And as the Rhine's black waters churned below, the men on both sides understood that the outcome of the battle, and perhaps the war's final chapter, now depended on whether that battered skeleton of steel could survive one more night. Night fell again over Remagen, but it brought no rest. The bridge that had defied demolition, bombing, and artillery now stood under the heaviest assault yet. The German command had thrown everything it could muster at the crossing, not to win the battle, but to erase the shame of having lost it. At midnight on March 10, 1945, waves of German aircraft approached the bridge in the dark. Some were new jet-powered Me-262s, others were aging Focke-Wulf 190s, barely airworthy. They carried heavy bombs slung under their wings and orders to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge at any cost. The Americans, alerted by radar, switched on searchlights and anti-aircraft guns along the riverbanks. The sky above Remagen erupted in chaos. Tracers stitched glowing arcs through the night, flak bursts thundered, and flaming aircraft plunged into the Rhine. Bombs fell close, some striking the water just yards from the piers, others hammering into the hillsides. The air trembled with concussions, and the bridge itself shuddered as if alive. But still, it stood. On the bridge deck, engineers and MPs directed traffic through clouds of smoke and flame. At times, the roar of aircraft overhead was drowned out by the grinding of tank treads. The air was thick with the metallic taste of cordite and the sharp tang of burnt oil. Soldiers shouted above the din, waving convoys forward even as bomb fragments clattered off the steel beams around them. By dawn, the attacks had failed once again. Several German planes lay burning in the river or smashed into the far bank. American gunners cheered briefly, then returned to their grim work. The bridge was still open, but the damage was worsening. Girders twisted, bolts sheared loose, and the central arch sagged nearly a foot. The U.S. Army engineers, refusing to yield, began constructing additional support pontoons beneath the bridge. They drove pilings into the riverbed, lashed cables across the span, and rigged cranes to lift replacement beams. Many worked waist-deep in icy water, their hands numb, their faces pale from exhaustion. Every hour they kept the bridge standing meant more troops and more pressure on the German lines east of the Rhine. By March 11th, the bridgehead had expanded to nearly 10 miles. Entire battalions of infantry and tanks were now operating east of the river. The breakthrough at Remagen had become more than a tactical success. It was a psychological earthquake. German civilians began abandoning towns ahead of the advancing Americans. Propaganda that once promised a Rhine miracle was replaced by silence. Still, the Germans refused to give up. On March 12th, they launched one of the strangest attacks of the war. From the hills near Linz, they fired radio-controlled boats packed with explosives, hoping to ram the bridge's piers. American spotters on the banks opened fire with machine guns, sinking most of them before they reached the target. One boat detonated prematurely, sending a column of water and flame into the sky. It was a desperate, almost medieval gesture, technology reduced to suicide weapons. As the German attacks grew more frantic, American efforts grew more relentless. Engineers completed 2 full floating bridges downstream, allowing supplies and reinforcements to cross even faster. The Ludendorff itself, however, remained the lifeline, the symbol of Remagen. Every soldier who crossed it knew they were stepping into history. Then came March 14th. The bridge had been under continuous strain for a full week. The steel was warped and fatigued. The main supports were cracked. The river current had weakened the piers. Engineers inspected it constantly, recording ominous creaks and vibrations. But the order remained the same: keep it open as long as possible. That afternoon, as fresh units of the 99th Infantry Division began crossing, a sharp metallic snap echoed through the valley. Witnesses later described a sound like a rifle shot magnified 1,000 times. The central arch buckled. Rivets popped from the girders in a burst of sparks. Then, without warning, the entire midsection of the bridge collapsed. Men on the deck had only seconds to react. Some jumped clear onto the near span. Others plunged with the falling steel into the freezing water below. A massive wave surged outward as the structure hit the river. Smoke and debris filled the air. Within moments, the once proud Ludendorff Bridge was gone, swallowed by the Rhine it had defied. Dozens of soldiers were killed or swept away. More than 100 were injured. Engineers, medics, and infantry scrambled to rescue survivors from the churning water. When the dust settled, the broken remains of the bridge jutted from the river like the ribs of a carcass. For the Germans, the collapse came too late. The damage was done. In the 10 days since its capture, over 25,000 American troops, 2,700 vehicles, and hundreds of tons of supplies had crossed into the German heartland. The bridge had fulfilled its purpose and changed the course of the campaign. As word spread through Allied ranks, there was no cheer, only quiet awe. The men who had fought, built, and died at Remagen understood what the crossing meant. They had torn open the last gate to Nazi Germany. On the far bank, American units pushed deeper toward the Ruhr, their columns rolling east through towns that had never imagined an enemy army would reach them. For the soldiers who crossed before the collapse, the memory of that trembling span, the sounds, the smells, the fear, would stay with them forever. The Rhine, Germany's proud frontier, had been breached not by planning or perfection, but by courage, timing, and endurance. The impossible had happened before the world's eyes, and in the silence after the bridge fell, the war itself began to crumble with it. The collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge on March 17, 1945, did not undo the impact of its capture 10 days earlier. By that moment, the Americans had already turned the Rhine crossing at Remagen into a strategic juggernaut. The 1st U.S. Army had established a bridgehead east of the river, stretching nearly 10 miles, allowing thousands of troops, artillery pieces, and supply vehicles to pour into Germany with unprecedented speed. The immediate consequence was psychological as much as tactical. For German soldiers, the loss of the Rhine's defensive line shattered morale. The river, which had for centuries symbolized security and separation, now appeared penetrable, even vulnerable. Veterans of the Wehrmacht reportedly wept at the realization that their homeland was no longer a sanctuary. Officers scrambled to rally troops, but discipline was disintegrating. Even elite units could not recover the lost ground, and counterattacks repeatedly failed against well-entrenched American forces. Hitler, upon learning of the bridge's capture, erupted in fury. The supreme commander of the German army, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, attempted to explain the failure: inadequate explosives, retreating troops interfering with demolition, and the chaos of collapsing communications. None of it mattered. Hitler's rage was absolute. Orders came down for executions of officers involved in the Remagen sector. Captain Willy Bragg, who had hesitated to destroy the bridge, was arrested, and German military bureaucracy was paralyzed by fear and confusion. Meanwhile, the American forces pressed their advantage. Engineers constructed Bailey bridges and pontoon spans downstream, ensuring that the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge did not halt the advance. Supplies flowed steadily across the Rhine, reinforcing the bridgehead and allowing armored divisions to continue inland. The speed of the crossing prevented the Germans from regrouping. Towns along the Rhine's east bank fell quickly, often without resistance, as demoralized defenders abandoned positions. Strategically, the capture of Remagen accelerated the Allied timetable for the invasion of Germany. Eisenhower had intended a cautious, multi-pronged crossing, but the Ludendorff Bridge allowed for an unplanned surge deep into the Rhineland. The Allies gained a critical foothold without the expected heavy casualties of a forced river crossing. Some estimates suggest that capturing Remagen may have shortened the war in Europe by several weeks, sparing countless lives that would have been lost in protracted assaults elsewhere along the Rhine. The human cost, however, was still real. During the bridge's final days, dozens of American soldiers were killed in artillery strikes, Luftwaffe attacks, and the eventual collapse of the span itself. Engineers, medics, and infantrymen worked continuously, often ignoring exhaustion and injury, to maintain the flow of men and material across the river. German casualties included hundreds killed or captured in the bridgehead, and thousands more surrendered as the Rhine barrier dissolved. In addition to immediate tactical gains, the capture of Remagen had profound psychological effects on both sides. For the Americans, it became a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and relentless initiative. Soldiers wrote letters home describing a bridge held together by sheer willpower and a crossing like stepping into history itself. It boosted morale across the Western Front, inspiring other units to press harder against the weakening German defenses. For the Germans, the loss was demoralizing on every level. Hitler reportedly called the Remagen incident a catastrophe beyond words, blaming officers, engineers, and even the population for failing to stop the Americans. Propaganda efforts tried to downplay the defeat, but news filtered through frontline units. The Rhine was breached. Germany's final defensive line had been pierced. The symbolic power of the bridge's capture far outweighed its physical significance. By mid-March, the Remagen bridgehead was firmly established. American engineers had completed multiple crossings, and armored units were advancing along the Ahr Valley toward the Ruhr. The collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge, rather than hindering the advance, became a moment of consolidation. It demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the Allied forces, a combination of audacity and engineering that the Germans could not match. The events at Remagen also had a lasting influence on military thinking. River crossings, historically the most perilous of operations, were now understood to require not just firepower and manpower, but speed, improvisation, and engineering innovation. The lessons learned would inform Allied operations in later campaigns, emphasizing that initiative and rapid exploitation could outweigh rigid planning. And yet, amid the strategic triumph, the shadow of human suffering lingered. Civilians in Remagen and surrounding towns watched their homes destroyed, their streets cratered by artillery, their neighbors caught in the crossfire. Soldiers on both sides bore the scars of exhaustion, trauma, and loss. The bridge that had become a symbol of ingenuity was also a monument to the brutality of war. As the Rhine lay behind them and the American advance surged into Germany, one fact remained undeniable. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge had irrevocably changed the course of the Western Front. It was a fleeting, fragile victory made permanent by courage, skill, and timing, a turning point that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The days following the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge saw the Remagen crossing evolve from a tactical victory into a decisive operational advantage. The Americans had established a fully functional bridgehead east of the Rhine, enabling continuous reinforcement of troops, artillery, and vehicles. By March 18, 1945, the 9th Armored Division, along with elements of the 78th and 99th Infantry Divisions, were operating well inside the Rhineland, pushing toward the industrial heartland of Germany. German attempts to retake the bridgehead failed repeatedly. Artillery barrages, airstrikes, and even sabotage could not undo the momentum. Field reports show that more than 6,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in the vicinity of Remagen. During this period, entire units surrendered rather than face the advancing Allied forces, their cohesion shattered by both fatigue and the psychological blow of losing the Rhine's last intact crossing. Hitler's response was both furious and symbolic. The High Command of the Wehrmacht ordered investigations, blamed officers for the failure to destroy the bridge, and executed those deemed responsible. The loss at Remagen was more than tactical. It represented the collapse of German control over their own destiny. Commanders on the eastern and western fronts began to question orders. Morale plummeted and discipline fractured. For the Allies, Remagen became a logistical triumph. Engineers had constructed additional pontoon and Bailey bridges downstream, ensuring that the collapse of the Ludendorff span did not halt the flow of men and materiel. Tanks, trucks, and supplies moved steadily across the Rhine, sustaining the rapid advance into the Ruhr and forcing the German army into retreat. The capture of the bridgehead allowed the Allies to envelop the Rhineland industrial cities, cutting off resources that were critical to Germany's war effort. Beyond the immediate military consequences, the crossing had immense symbolic value. For American troops, Remagen represented initiative and ingenuity overcoming entrenched defenses. Soldiers who had once faced endless resistance now advanced deeper into Germany, buoyed by the audacity of the operation. Letters and diaries from the period described the surreal nature of crossing a river that had been deemed impassable, and the sense of history unfolding beneath their boots. The psychological impact on the German population was equally profound. Civilians along the Rhine, previously assured that the river would protect them, now faced the reality of occupation. Reports from the era describe waves of refugees fleeing eastward, carrying possessions on handcarts and in wagons, fearful of the advancing Americans. Towns such as Erpel, Linz, and Bruckhausen experienced both chaos and panic, illustrating how Remagen accelerated the collapse of the home front. Strategically, historians estimate that the Remagen crossing shaved weeks off the Allied timetable for penetrating Germany. The ability to maintain a bridgehead without waiting for an orchestrated large-scale crossing allowed the First Army to exploit weaknesses in German defenses. The Ruhr pocket, Germany's industrial heart, fell faster than it might have otherwise, hastening the overall collapse of the Nazi war machine. The crossing also reshaped post-war military thought. Commanders studied the operation as an example of rapid exploitation of opportunity, the integration of engineering under fire, and the psychological leverage gained from unexpected tactical success. In subsequent conflicts, military planners would reference Remagen as a case study in the importance of speed, improvisation, and morale in combined arms operations. Yet, amid these achievements, the human cost remained stark. Casualties on both sides, combined with the destruction of infrastructure and civilian property, left a trail of suffering. Soldiers who had crossed the Rhine carried both pride and trauma, while German civilians and soldiers bore the weight of sudden defeat. The bridge itself, though destroyed, became a potent symbol, a testament to courage under fire, to the ingenuity of engineers, and to the unpredictable momentum of war. By late March 1945, the Remagen bridgehead was firmly secured, marking the beginning of a series of rapid Allied advances into central Germany. The Ludendorff Bridge had served its purpose, not only as a physical crossing but as a psychological lever that demonstrated the inevitability of Germany's defeat. It was a singular moment where human courage, engineering skill, and timing converged to accelerate the end of World War II in Europe. The Rhine had been breached, the Germans demoralized, and the road to the heart of Germany lay open. From this point forward, the final collapse of the Third Reich became not a question of if, but how quickly it could be achieved. The story of Remagen is, in many ways, a story of contradictions. It is a story of destruction and creation, despair and determination, chaos and ingenuity. A single bridge, designed for routine rail traffic decades earlier, became the fulcrum upon which the final weeks of the war in Europe pivoted. Its capture and temporary survival were not the product of grand strategy alone, but of human courage meeting opportunity at the exact right moment. Across the battered steel of the Ludendorff Bridge, soldiers faced fear, fatigue, and the constant threat of death. Engineers worked in darkness through smoke under artillery fire, patching a structure that should have collapsed at any moment. Each bolt replaced, each plank hammered into place, was a testament to human resolve in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. History remembers the generals and their plans, but it was these men, the ordinary soldiers and engineers, who made the impossible real. The Germans, meanwhile, witnessed the limits of control and the consequences of hesitation. Orders unfulfilled, demolitions delayed, and confusion at the command level turned what should have been an impenetrable barrier into a liability. The bridge became a mirror reflecting the fragility of a regime already crumbling under its own weight. Its collapse a prelude to the wider disintegration of the Third Reich. Remagen also embodies a larger lesson about warfare itself. That innovation, adaptability, and decisiveness can outweigh brute force or rigid planning. The American forces leveraged speed, initiative, and engineering skill to exploit a fleeting opportunity, transforming a tactical encounter into a strategic turning point. And yet, amid triumph, there is sorrow. The bridge claimed lives on both sides, scarred the town of Remagen, and highlighted the human cost of war. It reminds us that even in moments of ingenuity and courage, war is always measured in blood, fear, and loss. In the quiet decades that followed, the Ludendorff Bridge became more than steel and stone. It became a symbol, a monument to determination, a reminder that history can pivot on the edge of chance, and above all, a testament to the men who crossed, built, and held it, ordinary soldiers performing extraordinary feats, whose courage opened the gates to the heart of Germany and helped bring a devastating war to its final chapter. The Rhine had been crossed. Germany's last great barrier was gone, and the world would never forget the miracle of Remagen.